Today I'm going to talk about modesty, and this is something that priests are encouraged to do before the summer months, as there is a lot more tendency towards immodesty around us during the summer. And just to be straight with you, this is a sermon that most priests, certainly, find it a little difficult to talk about because many times it's taken the wrong way or misunderstood, and can be very difficult to talk about sometimes because of the way it's received. I mentioned this to some of my brothers and sisters yesterday as I was going through the prep for this sermon and thinking through it, and I can talk and call out men's irresponsibility or men's vices 10 times a year or to their face, and the reaction will be maybe ignore it or, yeah, thanks, Father, I needed to hear that. That's true. Yep. And many times when priests talk about modesty, the reaction we often get is, how dare you? Why would you think that about us? How dare you tell us what to do? Why you think I'm, insert derogatory female term there. It's not fun, I'll tell you that much. It's not fun to talk about because of how it's perceived. And I'll get to in a little bit why I think that is and what I think the root of that is. But I just wanted to say that before I begin, to say that when I'm talking about modesty, it is not with the view to put women down, but rather to ennoble them and to uplift them and to help them understand, as we do with every other virtue, what is the virtue that we're supposed to be aiming for, what the goal we're supposed to be striving for, and frankly, what is sin and what is not. So it is with that in mind that I will proceed. First of all, I want to talk about what is considered modest dress. And the standard that the church has given, that we as Catholics hold, is that for dress to be considered modest for women, should not be more than 2 fingers breadth below the pit of the throat. So that cuts out any deep V-necks, low-cut dresses or shirts or whatever. The shoulders need to be covered. And the dresses, or if, for whatever, needs to be below the knee. Now, this doesn't mean to say that if it's off by a couple centimeters, that it's a mortal sin. But it does mean if it's way off of that mark, then it would be a mortal sin. All sins have different degrees. And that's true of modesty as well. So that's the basic standard. And an important thing to point out is that this admits of no exceptions when it comes to being in public. People will often make exceptions in this area by saying, well, it's really hot. Or, well, that's what everybody else is doing. Or, well, I'm going to be playing sports or dancing or swimming or something of that nature. And modesty is something that doesn't admit of excuses for different circumstances. Pope Pius XII and others have specifically mentioned this, that it has to be upheld in all things, at all times, when in public. It's funny because I find with modesty, and one priest mentioned this to me, and I found it to be very true, that oftentimes with modesty, there's exceptions made with how it is perceived or how excuses or exemptions are made for it. For example, it's too hard to dress modestly because it's too hot. Well, do we say, it's too hard not to steal because I don't have enough money? We don't make exceptions for that. Or, I punched you in the face because it was too hot outside. We don't make exemptions like that for other things, so why does it hold true for modesty? because it's harder. Well, that's true of any sin, any vice, that there are times that it's going to be harder to do, for sure. But there's ways to minimize that, We're not saying that women have to be dressed in sackcloth or have to be, dressing like women do in Saudi Arabia. I'm not saying that. And for those, there are definitely ways to dress more coolly, wearing clothes that aren't so hot, certainly. But it doesn't mean that you can skimp on the modesty standard. Likewise, the different degrees, it's like, a lot of times with modesty, it's like, well, I skipped the standard. I didn't follow that code, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that far off. That's another thing. It's like, again, stealing. Why are you mad that I stole $20 from you? It's not like I stole $100 from you. Again, why are you mad that I punched you in the face? I didn't shoot you. It's like, why do we make excuses for different small degrees of sin? Yeah, I lied to you, but it was hard to be honest. Why are excuses made for that? We shouldn't make them. And we shouldn't try to find excuses for that. Now I want to get into a little bit of why. What's the reason behind it? Now that I've done this is what the standard is, and you got to just keep to that standard. Why is that? And whenever I talk about this, I like to go all the way back to Adam and Eve, because that's where this comes from. That's the reason that that men and women both have to be modest in their dress, in their comportment, in how they behave, how they speak, and how they look with their eyes. Goes back to Adam and Eve. There is no question that women are more beautiful than men. Nobody's going to disagree on that. And women, you can thank me for bringing that out rather than criticizing me. That is obvious. But why? It's very interesting because if you look at the rest of the animal kingdom, the opposite is true, in fact. If you look at, look at birds, for example. Look at the cardinal. When you think of a cardinal, you think of that beautiful red bird, right? Well, that's the male bird. When you look at the female cardinal, it's very different. It's not nearly as beautiful. When you look at a lion, you think of a lion, you think of the big shaggy mane and this powerful, beautiful animal. And you think of the other version, and it's a lot less beautiful. It's a lot less complex or beautiful. Why is it opposite with human beings? Why is it that the female, the woman, is more beautiful than the male with human beings? Well, look at Genesis. God created Adam, and then after Adam had been alone for a little while, and he named all the animals, and he looked at all these animals and saw they had a mate, and then Adam was alone, and he felt alone, and he saw no helper like himself. It was then that God created Eve. He put Adam into a deep sleep. It says that God took one of his ribs, and around that rib formed flesh and formed Eve. And God showed Adam that man is incomplete and that he cannot be fulfilled or find completion in himself alone. That what he is lacking, what he is missing, is found in woman. And the two complement each other. They are made for each other, to complement each other. And the beauty that is given to women is given for the sake of the man, that man might find the woman attractive and beautiful. That is why women are beautiful. It's not for their own sake. It's not so that they can be very vain and prideful and think themselves better than others. Actually, the reason that women are beautiful is for the sake of man. Because the purpose of male and female, of men and women, is for the procreation of the human race. That men and women might come together in marriage and have children and increase the human population, increase the number of souls that God chooses to create. Because with man and woman coming together, God forms a soul and creates another soul. A soul that is intended to be with God forever in the joy of heaven. And in order to encourage men and women to come together and to have children and to accept the responsibilities of marriage, God has put in every single one of us a deep attraction for the other in different ways. Men and women have a very different, wired very differently. If anybody doubts that, then, well, there's something wrong with you. Men and women are very, very different, and the way that they see attraction is very different. And this is so important to understand the reason and the need for modesty in both men and women, and the need of virtue with regard to men and women and how they interact with each other, how they look upon each other, how they treat one another. Because what's the purpose? Why do we have the 6th and 9th commandment? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Why do we have to fight against the passion of lust? Well, obviously, shorten the story. God's plan was interrupted, was marred by sin. And sin threw everything about our nature into disarray. So, whereas before original sin, man could look upon a woman, and a woman could look upon a man, with nothing sinful in their thoughts or desires. We read that Adam and Eve had no need for clothes, because they had no shame, they had no inclination to sin or lust. But after original sin, God clothed them. They didn't do it themselves and make their own standard about what was decent. God formed skins for them, clothes for them. You read that right in Genesis. God set the standard, not man, about what was decent and what was to prevent sin. This attraction has been marred and corrupted by sin. And in order to restore that innocence, and restore and maintain the innocence and the propriety and decency in this attraction, requires that we work for it and sustain those necessary virtues. Because if we just go according to our tendency, it leads to sin. And that is why we call, sins of the flesh impurity. The attraction is meant to be a pure attraction between a husband and a wife. The pleasure that is found there, the satisfaction that is found there is intended as a reward for husband and wife accepting the responsibility and the arduous task of raising children. That is a reward. And when that reward is sought outside of marriage, that is where it is impure and wrong and indecent, sinful. That is why we call it impure. It is not the pure love and attraction that is right and good. But I think to understand modesty and also purity, we have to look at the different ways that men and women are designed, that we're wired by God. And this, I think, gets into why many times the reaction of women when we talk about modesty, a lot of times it's handled the wrong way from both ends, and there's a misunderstanding. So men are especially wired, they're tempted to see, to behold that beauty, and to desire it. outside of marriage, outside of what is proper, that is wrong. Not to see a beautiful woman and say, oh, that person is beautiful, but to be drawn to the flesh, just to the body. That is the weakness that we have, that every man has, that we just look at the body, the flesh. So we call them sins of the flesh. And by being absorbed with that, we disrespect the person, the dignity of that woman, the beauty, the true beauty that is there. For women, they are specifically more tempted to be seen, to receive the attention of men. This is how they go together. They complement each other. And so for men, specifically, they have to really fight against lust, the desire for what is impure, for what is not theirs. That is what lust is. For women, modesty is more often than not tied to lust. It's not tied many times. I believe the majority of times, it is not tied to a desire to be lusted after, but vanity. And that root is pride, not lust. There is a desire in women to be seen as beautiful. That is natural. That is normal. And, for women to just be, men and women, to just not care at all about their appearance and to show out in public just like they're just woke up, well, that shows a disrespect for the dignity of that person. So we're not saying to women, don't worry about your appearance. No. But to obsess over that, I should say, and to take that to excesses is a sin of vanity, which is tied to pride. And by dressing immodestly, by wanting to be seen and wanting that attention to be drawn to your body, you may see it just as vanity or as wanting to be seen as beautiful. But the way that transfers, the way that crosses over, is that a man will see you as a piece of flesh and not as a woman, not as a beautiful woman created, specifically designed by God to be a mother. Doesn't mean that every woman has to be a mother, but a woman is made for that purpose. That's why there's male and female. So by immodesty, that lust, that desire for what is not theirs by right, is enkindled in men. And for most women, they just see it as, oh, they think I'm pretty, or they think I'm beautiful. Newsflash for women. You do not have to be dressed immodestly to be considered beautiful. And when I'm speaking about this, I'm not just pointing at the women here and saying, you. This is also for men to understand this. For young men to understand what to look for and what to avoid. It's for fathers to understand their role, and fathers and mothers to understand their role in teaching their children these things. Just lost my train of thought. Sorry. That's what it is. Beauty. The most attractive quality of a woman is the beauty that comes from God, a beauty that encourages virtue. When a man, the part that's missing in us, what a man desires in a woman, and what a woman desires in a man is goodness, virtue, strength, beauty, care, love. All of those good virtues, all of those beautiful things, that is what we desire. But because of sin, because of our fallen nature, we lose sight of that and get distracted by the appearance or by a feeling or emotion. We get distracted by that, and so we lose sight of what is actually the goal. It's harder for us with our fallen nature to see beyond just the external. So for women, the most attractive quality in a woman is virtue. It's true of men too. But modesty is a virtue. And it's incredible the power that women have over men, just in the way they behave and act. by their modest dress, by their modest behavior. That has such an effect on men. Even if they don't tell you that, it's true. What is inspired in men by seeing immodesty, especially gross immodesty, is this filthy, nasty feeling inside of us, this filthy desire for what we know is wrong, because we haven't accepted the responsibility that is meant to go with that. Even if we don't identify it as such, we know instinctively that it's wrong. We want to hide it unless we've lost all shame. But what is inspired by a woman in modest dress is a desire for what is good and beautiful and wholesome and virtuous. It's an incredible power that many women don't realize that they have. And I wish they did more. That's something in our culture that has been so destroyed and just forgotten. And that's something that I would say with regard to this topic of modesty is, when we go out in public, whether it's Walmart or wherever we go, there's immodesty everywhere. And too often, the response in better educated people is those awful people. How can they dress this way? And maybe that's true of that individual, but who is responsible for training them? Who is responsible for their upbringing? Who around them will tell them what is actually right and good? Because in our society, if you have it, flaunt it. That's the thing that's echoed over and over again to women. If you don't dress a certain way, you're not going to keep up with the other women and girls that are dressing this way. And it's so stupid because it demeans men and women, demeans us all, and the great purpose for which God has created us. So if you see immodesty, which we all do, say a prayer for that person. Remember that this problem has, especially in our country, probably goes back 100 years, about it being the societal norm, being accepted by everybody and encouraged in schools and in Hollywood and in all circles. Pray for that person. That grace might win for them, that prayer might win for them some grace to convert, to realize. But I'm going over long with this sermon, but it's such a vital subject for our day, because the problems we see in society trace their origin so much to this. Because what is society made up of? Families. What destroys families more than anything? Sin. A failure to accept responsibilities. Forgetting our purpose, the goal of why we exist. And think it through. Why do we have the 6 and 9 commandments? Why is there this need for modesty and for virtue, chastity, etc., in men and women? Okay? A man and a woman get married. Okay? They spend some time together. Things are going well. Great. They made the commitment to be together for life, to raise children, take care of them, etc. Okay. Well, the man has never practiced modesty of the eyes, has never fought against lust. So while he is very easily distracted by other women, he takes pleasure in lust with other women. How does the woman think about that? How does his wife think about that? And then if he commits some sin of adultery or something like that, what's going to happen to that union? Falls apart, most likely. Certainly makes it extremely difficult, but a lack of chastity in men, fighting against lust, makes men want to leave their wife for some other woman who he finds attractive at that moment, more attractive. Same thing for women. If they find a man, if they're married and things are getting rough and difficult and not getting along as well as they could, and she finds a man that gives her more attention than her husband does, how is she going to be encouraged if she is just so used to vanity and wanting overly much that attention and attraction from men, what's going to happen to that marriage? And what effect does that have? Who suffers the most? The children. And then that leads to them most likely falling into the same things when they get older. That's the problem in our society today. Sin in all of its different forms, the lack of responsibility in men and women, fathers and mothers. These things need to be taught to children and encouraged, because they're not going to get it out in the world. They're not going to get it on social media. They're constantly going to get the opposite. So if this isn't instilled in our youth and constantly guarded and protected, it will not become a virtue, a habit. It has to become a habit, it has to become the norm. That's how we will be able to restore Christ in our society. It's by starting with individual families or couples or individuals living that way as Christ, as God intended us to live. So, women, please remember that your greatest beauty is virtue and modesty, and in inspiring men to beauty and goodness and virtue. You have an incredible power to stir up a desire for that goodness in men. So dress modestly at all times, whenever in public. And for men, you have to dress modestly too. Usually that's not a problem with guys. But, we have to fight against vanity too. Usually vainglory, wanting to be thought strong, wanting to be thought better than others. That's the vanity that we have to attack. But we, more than women, have to fight against lust. And there's occasions of sin everywhere. We are very much hampered in what we can watch, what we can listen to, where we can go, who we can spend time with, because those occasions of sin are everywhere, and we have such a strong pull to it. So this is something that has to be worked on by both men and women. But if we do so, that will lead to many graces and blessings that stem from that virtue and living as God intended us to. So let us always work on humility so that we don't become excessively vain, and also chastity, purity of thought, desire, action, speaking. These two virtues have to exist in us. Otherwise, they won't exist at all in society. So, I didn't come up with a good ending, so we'll just end it right there. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.